Read news articles has two parts. One is reading from the DynamoDB table, and for that I'll be using this particular endpoint, which is read news articles. Sorry. The next one would be to read from the external API, that is newsapi.org, right? So we have to implement two APIs or two URL endpoints. So one would read from the DynamoDB table and the other one would read from the external API. So for that I have created one more function, news API underscore org, and the endpoint itself is newsapi.org. So I'll be using this particular API to read from the external API. I have not done the coding yet. I'll do it right now. But for the read news articles, I'm allowing get method and it will be reading from the DynamoDB table. Let me just walk you through really quick. I'm importing Boto3 as usual and the request class from Flask module. So what am I doing? I'm instantiating the client and then I'm creating an empty dictionary variable and getting the channel ID and the news date. Now, what would happen is that I can pass either channel ID and news date or only news date. So I can pass just the news date. And so what would happen is that news from all the channels would be shown for that particular news date, or I can pass the news date and the channel ID. So in that case, all the news for that channel ID and for a specific date would be shown. So I'll have to implement the both. This is again a little new. I'm getting the news date using request args.get method. And here, what am I saying is that if news date is not null. So this essentially means if the variable has some value, then do some processing. Else error out that mandatory parameter news date, optional parameter is channel ID. So this is the message that would be sent. And let's say I do not pass the news date, then this particular variable would have null value. And to check whether a particular variable has null value or not, this is how we do that using Python. So if I mention if just the news date or just the variable without any conditional parameter, I'm checking that if news underscore date variable is not null, then do some processing. Okay, so after that, I'm also checking the channel ID variable. So it might happen that I have sent just the news date, not the channel ID. In that case, news from all channel IDs would be shown. But if the channel ID is passed, then I'm checking if channel ID is not null. And if both the cases, I am again checking the length of the variables so that the length of the variables are greater than 0, because you can pass space also. So if both the variables have been passed, then I'm using this getItem API from DynamoDB to read a single record. And the table name is 3IAM news articles. I'm passing the article published at value, and this I'm saying DynamoDB that this is a string value. Same is the case with channel ID. I'm saying DynamoDB that this is the string, this is a string value. And article published at is the partition key and article channel ID is the short key. If you remember, that's how we created the DynamoDB table. But you don't have to worry about it. You can just copy and paste this code and you don't have to change anything also. And if we get any value, putting the value in this data variable, if the length of news data is greater than 0, which means that channel ID has been passed, but it does not contain any value. So in that case, I want to get all the news for that particular date. For this, I'm using DynamoDB query API. I cannot use the getItem API. The table name, and I'm just passing the news date. And I'll remove this print and return the data. So first, let's go ahead and test this out, and then I'll come back to the newsapi.org. And I'll have to implement that in a different EC2 instance. This read news articles would be stored or would be run actually in the separate EC2 instance that we have created, which is the second one, backend 2, and this is the IP address. And here what will I do? I do not have anything. Let me go ahead and create the Python program, readnewsarticles.py, and what will I do is that I'll copy and paste the entire code here. And let me copy and paste. As I told you earlier, this is not how this should be done. You should use a CI/CD pipeline to deploy the code in the EC2 instance, or if you're using EKS or ECS, you need to use a deployment pipeline in all the cases. So let me run this code. Okay, so it is running on port number 10001. And the next thing that I have to do is that I'll have to implement this ReadNews front-end API, which is this one, and this is empty. Let me go ahead and implement the ReadNews front-end API. The first one would be the endpoint ReadNews, and what it would do, it would make a call to the ReadNewsArticles API. And what I can do, I can use this requests.get directly here. So I'm not using requests.request method, I'm using requests.get. And in the first argument, I'll have to pass the endpoint of the API, which is the public IP address and the port number, that is 10001. And after that, I'll have to pass the URL endpoint, and I'll have to pass some parameters also, right? So I'll capture the parameter in the parm variable. So let's see what the parm variable would contain. I need the news date. So I'll capture this news date using the request class .args.get, and I'll mention news date here. So I'll pass it using this particular variable from Postman, and the next one would be channel ID. And I'll use the same variable name to get it. Now let's define the parm variable, which should be a dictionary, and here I'll have to pass the channel ID and the news date. So it's the same name. Let me pass the news date, which would be the variable news date itself, and channel ID, which would be the variable channel ID itself. And now I'm passing the parameters, right? And if response.status code is equal to 200, then I'll have to capture the value that was sent by ReadNewsArticles, and the value is being sent in data, right? So that's what you are seeing. We are getting the value in data, and that is being passed as JSON. So let me use the JSON variable of this RESP object. Okay, so or else this would be the error message that could not retrieve news for this date, and I'll return the data variable. So of course I'll have to define the data variable as a empty dictionary, and that's how. So the most important part of this particular code is this piece, where I'm calling the read news articles, passing the parameter, and if the response code is 200, then I'm capturing the data variable. If the response code is not 200, then I'll capture, or I'll send the message could not retrieve news for this date. Okay, so I'll have to pass the channel ID and the news date. So let's go ahead and run this one also, because it will be calling the API which is hosted on the EC2 instance. And this particular API would run in port number 8001. Report news is running on 8002 and read news is running on 8001. Add news articles is running on the other EC2 instance on port number 10002, and read news articles is running on the second EC2 instance on port number 10001. So now let's go ahead and try this out, or test this out rather. So I'll have to use this API read news, and the port is 8001. Here I'll have to pass two parameters, right? There won't be any body as such, but I'll be passing two parameters. One is news underscore date equal to, let's say, today's date, and I'll have to pass the channel ID also. Let's say ABC. Let's see if I can get any output. The method is wrong. This is a put method, and I'll have to use get method. So let's see. So the HTTP status code is 200, but we did not find any record because there is no channel ID with this name. So let me remove the channel ID and then send it. And now what it is doing, it is sending all the news for that particular date from DynamoDB, as you can see. So we had sent just the news date, not the channel ID. And what would happen if I remove channel ID? So even if I remove channel ID, this is fine. I can pass just the news date. What would happen if, let's say, I pass just the channel ID? This says mandatory parameter news date, optional parameter channel ID. So I'll have to pass the news date for sure. Okay, so now let me pass a channel ID which is existing, channel 242, and I should be able to see one record. So this is the record that has been sent. Now this response is of DynamoDB format. I have not made any changes, I have not done any formatting on my Python code, please go ahead and do that. I would recommend you to print it in a better way. But anyway, it is working. So I can get news from all the channels for a particular date if I just pass the news date. And as you can see, I have multiple records here. If I pass news date and channel ID, then I'll get only one record. If I send channel ID as empty, that is also fine. I'll get all the records for that particular date. But if I send just channel ID, not the news date, then it will give me error saying that news date is mandatory parameter. Now, what would happen if I pass both of them as empty? So it says news date is mandatory parameter. So this is also working, and the architecture is as such that read news is running on my local machine, but read news articles is running on the EC2 instance. And this is reading from the DynamoDB table if we pass either date or date and channel ID. Now let's go ahead and implement this newsapi.org API, which is an external API. So here I'll show you how you can implement an external API also. This is also possible because there can be a requirement as such that you need to implement an external API. It can be from bank, it can be from news, it can be from some credit rating organization, etc. So all of them would provide some external API, and we'll have to use that external API to get the data. First, let me show you the newsapi.org. This is the endpoint https://newsapi.org. So this is the endpoint. Now, one thing is that you have to log in if you want to use this. So let me log in. Now, once you log in, it will give you this API key. And this API key is important. Now let me go back to the home page. So these are the various APIs that it provides. Again, it is free, so obviously you will not get something fancy. It is just for testing. This is the endpoint, right? HTTP endpoint. And I'll have to pass the API key. And this is the API key for my account. For your account, the API key might be different. And these are the various endpoints. This is the first endpoint. This is the second endpoint, and you have to use the get method. Then we have third endpoint. This is the third endpoint. Then we have fourth endpoint, and so on. Only 5 endpoints are given. So the first one is article from Wall Street Journal. If you want to use, you can use that, or you can use from TechCrunch, or the top business headlines in US right now, or the Tesla article from last month, or Apple article from yesterday. So these are the external APIs that it provides. So let us go ahead and implement this. Now, as per the architecture, I'll have to implement the get HTTP request in ReadNewsArticles program, right? So this program would read the external API. So let's go ahead and change that. And this is the newsapi.org. What we have to do is that we need a few things. First, let's use the requests module and the get method, because newsapi.org gives you only get method, right? So you can see the method here. We cannot use any other method. And then the URL, and then some parameters have to be passed. So you know how do we pass the parameter? We use the parm variable, right? All right. So now what should be the endpoint? And the endpoint can be till here. HTTPS newsapi.org/v2/everything. Then we have query parameter q equal to Tesla. Then we have and from, which is another query parameter. Then third query parameter. And finally, we have the API key. We cannot pass any variable value. We can only pass the API key. So we'll have to make sure that the API key is passed. So what I can do, I can copy this entire URL and paste it here. It would work like this, but obviously you should not do that. What will I do is that I'll pass this query parameters separately, and this is the endpoint. So it is giving error that requests is not there, so I'll have to import the requests library here as well. Okay, so now let's get the query parameters. And the only query parameter that we are allowed to pass is the API key. So we'll get the API key from request.args.get, and I'll name it as API key. And we have other parameters also which are already there. So I'll define those parameters here. And these are the parameters. As I said, we cannot change Tesla, we cannot change the from parameter, we cannot change the sort by parameter and its value. But the only thing that you can pass is the API key. Okay, so now I'm passing this parameter. Of course, if the response status code is equal to 200, then data should be resp.json method. Now, why am I using JSON method? Because if you see here, it is sending the output in JSON only, because this is a REST API. The communication has to happen using JSON. And these many rows are there, these many records are there rather, right? The entire record is passed as JSON. That's why I'm using this data equal to resp.json, or else the error message, error calling external API, and I'll return the data variable which have to be defined as an empty dictionary. Okay, so this is newsapi.org, and I'm implementing this in the read news articles. So what I have to do is that I'll have to implement the same in my read news front-end API. I'll just copy this and paste it here. I'll be using the same endpoint newsapi.org, and the method would be get, and I'll capture the API key as usual, but I'm not calling the external API here. Here I'll have to call the internal API, which is ReadNewsArticles. And where am I running this? I'm running this in the second EC2 instance, whose IP address is this one. Okay, so let's change this, and the port number would be 10,001, and the API or the URL endpoint would also be newsapi.org. And I have to pass only one parameter here, which is the API key. Now, how am I capturing the API key here? Using this API key variable, and let me pass that here. Okay, so now again, if the status code is 200, it's fine, or else it's an error. Now this program has to be run in my local machine, and this one has to be run in the EC2 instance. So as I have made some changes, let me copy and paste in the EC2 instance. Now, as I said earlier, you should not do it like this, because you should use tools like Git, which will push the code in the repository, and from there it will trigger a CI/CD pipeline which will deploy the code either in EC2 instance or in the ECS machine. I'm getting an error, says requests module is not found. That is fine. I'll have to install the requests library of Python. This is another prerequisite, it seems. All right, so it is running now on EC2 instance, and this one is running on my local machine. So now let me use Postman to send the request to this front-end API. So this is the endpoint, and I'll have to pass the API key which was given to me by newsapi.org. Let me send it. So it says it could not send a request. Sorry, I have started read news articles. I do not have to do that. I'll have to start read news, not read news articles. Now send it again. Okay, so I've got the response from the external API, and you can actually match this, that this is the response that I want. So I'm getting the Tesla information, not anything else, right? So that is the API that I'm using. So both these are working. Finally, we'll have to implement the breaking news API.